Sometimes, the weight of the entire world can crash down upon the shoulders of a single person, and no one around seems to notice that she is drowning in silence, fighting against emotional currents that threaten to drag her soul to depths she never imagined possible. You could perceive that something was profoundly wrong when the brightest star of women's basketball began to lose the sparkle in her eyes, carrying a psychological burden that no young woman of her age should bear alone, like a child trying to carry the weight of entire mountains on her fragile shoulders. Caitlin Clark had become much more than an exceptional basketball player. She was a cultural phenomenon, a force of nature who had transformed women's basketball from an occasional curiosity watched by few into a magnetic spectacle that captured the attention of millions of people around the world. Entire arenas filled to capacity when she played, creating an electric atmosphere that rivaled the greatest sporting events. Television audience records were systematically broken with each of her appearances. Children of all ages asked for her jerseys as birthday gifts, dreaming of one day playing like her. But with this meteoric fame and worldwide adoration came something that no one had anticipated. Something sinister that began to corrode her young soul like slow and relentless acid, destroying her inner peace, drop by drop. The pressure was not merely about athletic performance or results on the court. It was about impossible perfection that could never be achieved by any human being. It was about representing not just a specific team, but an entire generation of female athletes who placed their hopes on her shoulders. It was about carrying expectations that grew exponentially with each conquest, like an emotional avalanche that gains destructive force as it descends the mountain, threatening to bury everything in its path. Naturally, this leads us to understand the profound and suffocating isolation that began to envelop Caitlin like a thick fog that obscured her vision of the future. Because when you become greater than the sport you practice, when your every movement is dissected and analyzed microscopically by millions of people, you discover a devastating truth. The deepest loneliness can exist even in the midst of adoring crowds and deafening applause. The criticisms came from all sides like poisoned arrows shot by invisible archers. It didn't matter how many historical records she broke with performances that defied the laws of physics. There were always discordant voices saying it wasn't enough, that she was being overrated, that her fame was undeserved. It didn't matter how many impossible plays she converted with the precision of an artist creating masterpieces. There were always those who found microscopic flaws where others saw absolute perfection. Have you ever wondered what it's like to wake up every day knowing that millions of people are anxiously waiting for you to fail so they can say, "I knew she wasn't that special after all"? It was exactly this devastating psychological reality that Caitlin faced in absolute silence. Each morning had become a brutal psychological battle against impossible expectations to be met. Each game had transformed into a test of emotional endurance that went far beyond the four white lines of the basketball court, testing mental limits she didn't even know she possessed. And the most devastating of all? She was facing this emotional war practically alone, without true allies who understood the magnitude of the pressure she carried. It's impossible not to feel the crushing weight when we realize that the most venomous attacks didn't come merely from direct adversaries on the court during games. They came from unexpected and painful places, from people who should have been celebrating her unquestionable greatness, but chose to question her legitimacy for reasons that seemed rooted in envy or resistance to change. Social media comments that cut her self-esteem like sharp blades. Journalistic articles questioning whether she really deserved all the worldwide attention she received. Sports analysts endlessly debating whether her success was real or just temporary hype that would soon disappear. It was like watching someone desperately trying to extinguish the sun because its brightness was too intense for their sensitive eyes. The pressure accumulated inside her mind like superheated steam in a pot without an escape valve. Caitlin smiled bravely for cameras during interviews, gave polite and diplomatically correct answers, maintained the professional composure everyone expected of her. But inside, something fundamental was breaking silently, like glass developing imperceptible cracks that would eventually lead to complete shattering. She began to question herself in ways she had never imagined possible during her dreamy childhood. Do I really deserve all this? Worldwide recognition? Maybe they're right, and I'm just a temporary phenomenon that will soon be forgotten. What if I can't maintain this level of excellence forever? What if I disappoint all the people who believe in me? How is it possible that someone so talented and objectively exceptional would begin to doubt her own greatness so profoundly? The devastating answer lay in the destructive power of constant and relentless pressure, combined with the emotional isolation that accompanies exceptionality. When you're at the top of the mountain, the fall seems infinitely more frightening and dangerous. When all the world's eyes are fixed on you, every microscopic error is amplified exponentially, echoing through millions of critical voices. Caitlin had become an involuntary prisoner of her own exceptionality. Each historical achievement automatically increased expectations for the next performance. Each extraordinary game became the new minimum standard expected by fans and critics. It was an ascending spiral that, paradoxically, was consuming her emotionally from within, like a machine that self-destructs by constantly running at maximum speed. The nights became periods of psychological torture. The silence of the room painfully amplified the echoes of criticism she desperately tried to ignore during daylight hours. It was like trying to fall asleep peacefully while a devastating emotional storm raged incessantly inside her young and overwhelmed mind. It was after yet another performance that any rational and fair person would call absolutely spectacular and historical. She had led her team to victory with statistical numbers that few in the sport's history had managed to achieve in their entire careers. Her plays were works of pure art, combining impeccable technique with creativity that defied logical explanation. But instead of deserved celebration and recognition of her greatness, the post-game analysis focused obsessively on the few microscopic plays that could have been executed slightly better, as if absolute perfection were the only acceptable standard for measuring her worth. On that specific night, alone in her room, with only the moon as a silent witness, Caitlin Clark did something she had never done before in her entire meteoric career. She cried from pure emotional exhaustion and profound despair. They weren't tears of athletic defeat or temporary competitive frustration. They were tears of someone who had given absolutely everything of herself, extracted every last drop of talent and effort from her soul, and discovered that everything still wasn't considered enough by a world that had become impossible to satisfy, no matter how extraordinary her performance. Something that touches deeply into the human heart is realizing how even the strongest and most resilient among us can reach the absolute limit of emotional resistance. Caitlin wasn't just an extraordinary athlete with supernatural abilities. She was a young human being carrying more psychological weight than any person should carry alone, regardless of their age or talent level. It was in this moment of maximum vulnerability and absolute despair that she asked herself for the first time if it would really be worth continuing. If the psychological price of greatness was the permanent loss of her inner peace and personal happiness. If perhaps it would be better to choose being mediocre and emotionally stable than exceptional and psychologically shattered. But have you ever wondered what happens when the universe decides to intervene mercifully, exactly at the moment when we most need a miracle? Because somewhere distant, at that exact moment of Caitlin's despair, Steph Curry was observing her situation with growing concern and profound empathy. He recognized all the signs of emotional suffering because he himself had gone through similar psychological pressures at different moments of his career. He knew intimately what it was like to carry impossible expectations on one's shoulders. He understood perfectly the devastating isolation that accompanies exceptionality in high-level sports. And for the first time in his illustrious career, Steph Curry decided that he could no longer remain in moral silence watching a young star be consumed by the same type of destructive psychological pressure that he had faced and overcome. It was like watching someone drowning in turbulent waters and finally deciding it was time to courageously jump into the water to offer help, regardless of personal risks. What impresses most profoundly is that Curry didn't need to get involved in the situation. He had his own legendary career to manage, his own family and professional responsibilities, his own complex life to handle. But something in Caitlin's situation touched a deep moral fiber in his compassionate soul. Something that made him feel he had not just the opportunity, but the ethical duty to act. In that decisive moment, without Caitlin knowing that her emotional salvation was being prepared, one of the most respected and influential voices in world basketball was preparing to do something that would change her life forever in ways she couldn't even imagine. Steph Curry was about to use his supreme credibility and worldwide respectability as a protective shield around Caitlin Clark. He was preparing to say words that would not only defend her publicly, but that would transform her emotionally from within, healing psychological wounds she didn't even know could be healed. It was as if the benevolent universe was preparing the greatest emotional gift Caitlin could receive, precisely at the moment when she most desperately needed renewed hope and genuine validation. The deafening silence that had surrounded Caitlin for endless months was about to be broken by the most powerful and respected voice in modern basketball. And when Steph Curry decides to speak with genuine purpose, when he chooses to use his words as an instrument of emotional healing, miracles of personal transformation begin to happen in ways that defy rational explanation. Caitlin's devastating emotional loneliness was coming to a definitive end. The deepest and most lasting transformation of her life was about to begin magnificently. And it would all start with words she would never forget. Words that would leave her literally speechless, but would fill her heart with a renewed strength she never knew it was possible to possess. It's impossible not to feel that something truly magical and transformative was approaching like a healing storm, that the emotional darkness that had consumed Caitlin for so long was about to be replaced by a light so bright and powerful that it would change not just her personally, but everyone who witnessed her miraculous transformation of emotional rebirth. And then happened the moment that no one expected, but that the universe had orchestrated with divine perfection, as if all cosmic forces had conspired to create an instant of healing that would completely transcend the boundaries of sports and touch the core of human experience. Steph Curry is not the type of person who speaks from emotional impulse or seeks unnecessary attention for personal benefit. Every word that emerges from his mouth is carefully weighed, meticulously measured, laden with a moral responsibility he takes very seriously as a sacred burden. So, when he decided to break his characteristic silence about Caitlin Clark's emotionally devastating situation, you knew instantly that something extraordinary and transformative was about to happen. You can perceive that a truly historical moment is forming when the greatest revolutionary of the three-point shot in history decides to use his supreme credibility and worldwide influence not for self-promotion or personal gain, but exclusively to elevate and protect another person who was suffering unjustly. It was an apparently ordinary Tuesday morning when Steph Curry was casually approached by journalists after a routine training session of his team. The initial question was simple, almost casual in its formulation. "Steph, what's your opinion about what Caitlin Clark has been doing for women's basketball and all the impact she's generating?" In that crucial moment, Curry could have easily given a diplomatically safe and politically correct answer. Some polite words about her certainly being talented or doing admirable work for the sport. It was exactly the type of superficial and non-committal response that everyone expected, and that would be forgotten in a matter of hours. And it was precisely the opposite of what they received. Instead of opting for the safe path of neutrality, Steph Curry looked directly at the camera with an intensity that cut through any superficiality and decided to speak with his heart completely open, exposing his deepest convictions. "Let me be absolutely clear about something important," he began, and there was a focused intensity in his voice that made everyone in the room instantly stop what they were doing to pay total attention. "Caitlin Clark is not just talented. She's not just special or impressive. She is a genuine generational talent that appears once every 2 decades, maybe less." It was possible to physically feel the electricity in the air changing, as if the atmosphere itself had become charged with meaning. Experienced journalists exchanged glances with genuine surprise, instinctively realizing they were witnessing something very different from the usual pattern of superficial sports interviews. But Steph Curry was just beginning to articulate thoughts he had kept for months of careful observation. "I have spent my entire career obsessively studying the science and art of shooting," he continued, his voice gaining technical conviction that cut through any possible skepticism. "I have broken records that seemed mathematically impossible, fundamentally changed the game, forced entire teams around the world to rethink defensive strategies that had existed for decades. And I'm saying this with all the technical authority that my experience and achievements provide me. What Caitlin Clark does with the ball is pure art in its highest form. How is it possible that the greatest shooter in human history validates another person with such technical specificity and scientific precision?" The answer came in the form of the most detailed, excited, and technically precise analysis that Steph Curry had ever given about any player other than himself, including his own teammates and historical rivals. Her absurd range, the supernatural speed of her release, the unshakable confidence to shoot from distances other players wouldn't even consider attempting. Curry made a deliberate pause, as if he were savoring each technical word he pronounced. "But what impresses me most profoundly is not just the raw technical talent, however exceptional it may be. It's the psychological courage. It's the mental capacity to assume impossible responsibilities and consistently transform them into moments of absolute greatness." In that specific moment, you could clearly perceive that Steph Curry wasn't just politely praising a professional colleague for reasons of sports etiquette. He was passionately defending someone he recognized as a true kindred spirit, a soul who intimately understood the psychological weight of carrying impossible expectations on young shoulders. "And let me speak honestly about the psychological pressure she faces daily," Curry continued, his voice now laden with deep and genuine empathy that touched the hearts of everyone listening, regardless of their interest in basketball. I know exactly what it's like to have the entire world microscopically watching every movement you make. I understand intimately what it's like to carry the hopes and dreams of millions of people. I understand perfectly what it's like to be mercilessly criticized even when you give your absolute best. It was impossible not to feel the authentic and visceral emotional connection behind his carefully chosen words. Steph Curry was speaking as someone who had personally walked the same solitary path of exceptionality and understood all the psychological challenges that accompany this unique journey. "But here's what I want everyone to understand with absolute clarity," he said, leaning slightly toward the camera, as if he were speaking directly and personally to Caitlin through the screen. Caitlin Clark not only deserves every sincere praise she receives, she deserves infinitely more respect and protection than she has received so far. What impresses most profoundly is that Curry didn't stop there, choosing to give vent to feelings he had kept for months of concerned observation. "I want her to know with absolute certainty that there are people in this world who recognize her greatness without envy, without reservations, without qualifications or limitations," he proceeded, his voice now laden with palpable emotion that was impossible to ignore or question. "I want her to understand that when I see her play, I see someone who is literally redefining what is possible in basketball, pushing boundaries we didn't even know existed. Have you ever wondered what the transformative power is of hearing your qualities being recognized specifically by someone you deeply admire?" Steph Curry still hadn't finished his statement. He had consciously decided to use his worldwide platform for something infinitely greater than a simple passing compliment. "And to any person who still questions whether she is real or if it's just temporary hype," he said, his voice now carrying an authority that admitted no contradiction or debate. "Let me permanently resolve that doubt for you. Caitlin Clark is the inevitable future of basketball. And anyone who can't see this clearly simply doesn't understand the game at its most fundamental level." It was like watching an absolute master validate another master in formation with the supreme authority of someone who had literally conquered everything possible to conquer in the sport, with nothing more to prove or gain. But then came the moment that would change everything forever. The statement that would echo across continents and transform not just the public perception of Caitlin Clark, but the perception she had of herself as a person and athlete. "Caitlin," he said, looking directly at the camera as if he were speaking personally and intimately with her in a private conversation, "if you're watching this, I want you to know one fundamental thing. You are not alone in this difficult journey. There are people here who understand exactly what you're going through psychologically. And we want you to continue being exactly who you authentically are, because who you are is changing the world of basketball forever." Naturally, this leads us to the seismic and immediate impact these words had on the sports world and beyond. Because when Steph Curry decides to use his credibility to emotionally shield another person, the effect is transformational, at levels that completely transcend sports. Within minutes, the video was circulating vertiginously across all imaginable social media platforms, not as another routine sports clip, but as a moment of pure humanity and authentic emotional connection that completely transcended basketball boundaries and touched universal questions of empathy and human support. Sports commentators who had spent months meticulously questioning every aspect of Caitlin's rise suddenly found themselves without valid arguments or credibility to continue their criticisms. How do you technically debate against Steph Curry about basketball? How do you question the professional assessment of the man who had literally redefined the modern sport? Fans who already unconditionally supported Caitlin felt validated in a deep and emotional way. It was like having their own perceptions and intuitions confirmed by the greatest possible technical authority on the subject, removing any residual doubt they might have had. But the most important and lasting impact wasn't happening in the noisy social media or professional analysts' comments. The most significant impact was developing somewhere private and silent, where a young woman was about to discover she wasn't as emotionally alone as she had imagined in her darkest moments. Because at that exact transformative moment, Caitlin Clark was watching Steph Curry's words for the first time. And what happened next with her, what those words did to heal her wounded soul, would be something she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. It was like watching the sun rising majestically after the darkest and most desperate night. Like seeing colorful flowers blooming spontaneously after a winter that seemed eternal and endless. Like witnessing emotional healing happening in real time before our eyes. The most powerful and transformative words are those that arrive exactly when we most desperately need to hear them. And Steph Curry had just delivered the most necessary words of Caitlin Clark's life, precisely at the moment when she most needed hope, validation, and the simple certainty that she wasn't alone in her struggle. Something that touches deeply into the human heart is realizing how unexpected and genuine acts of kindness can literally save emotional lives that were on the brink of collapse. And what was about to happen to Caitlin Clark was nothing less than an emotional miracle happening in real time. The deepest and most lasting transformation of her life was about to begin magnificently. And it all started with an extraordinary man who consciously decided to use his influential voice to heal emotionally instead of just superficially impressing. It was an apparently ordinary Wednesday afternoon when Caitlin Clark's life changed forever in ways she could never have anticipated. She was at home, desperately trying to find a moment of peace and quietude amidst the constant emotional chaos of her overwhelmed routine, when her phone began to vibrate incessantly as if it had come to life. Message after message arrived in rapid succession from close friends, worried family members, coaches, teammates, and even people she barely knew, all saying variations of the same urgent thing. You need to see immediately what Steph Curry said about you. It's something absolutely extraordinary. You can perceive that something truly extraordinary is happening when people who normally never speak out about sports matters begin urgently sending you links, as if they had just witnessed a miracle that needed to be shared with the entire world. Initially, Caitlin hesitated significantly. In the last psychologically devastating months, she had painfully learned to be extremely careful with things people said about her on the internet. Often, they were just more destructive criticisms disguised as superficial technical analyses, or empty and superficial praise that didn't really touch what she was emotionally experiencing inside. But something in the specific urgency and different energy of the messages she received made her intuitively feel that this time was fundamentally different. There was a different emotional vibration in the words of the people contacting her. It was as if they had witnessed something deeply significant that needed to be shared immediately. With her heart accelerated for reasons she couldn't rationally explain, Caitlin took a deep breath and clicked on the first link she had received. And then, her life changed forever in ways that transcended her most optimistic expectations. Steph Curry's first words hit her like a wave of emotional warmth that instantly spread throughout her entire body, from head to toe. Let me be absolutely clear about something important. Caitlin Clark is not just talented. She is a genuine generational talent that appears once every 2 decades. Caitlin stopped breathing completely for a long moment. She had to pause the video and replay it from the beginning, because she couldn't believe what her ears were registering. Steph Curry. The Steph Curry. The man who had completely revolutionized modern basketball. The player she had admired since childhood as an unattainable hero, was talking about her with conviction and technical specificity she had never heard from anyone in her entire life. How is it possible that someone you place on an emotional pedestal refers to you with such deep respect, technical admiration, and personal validation? But when Curry began to elaborate on specific technical aspects of her game, Caitlin felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest. It wasn't physical pain. It was as if an emotional dam she had meticulously built for months to protect herself was finally giving way under the weight of genuine validation. Her absurd range, the supernatural speed of her release, the unshakable confidence to shoot from distances other players wouldn't even consider attempting. What impresses me most profoundly is not just the raw technical talent, it's the psychological courage. The word courage hit her like a devastating emotional lightning bolt. For endless months, she had constantly questioned whether she was courageous enough, strong enough, good enough to deserve the position she occupied. And here was Steph Curry, her greatest technical reference in basketball, specifically calling her courageous with absolute conviction. Tears began to form in her eyes, but she still wasn't emotionally prepared for the impact of what would come next. When Curry spoke specifically about psychological pressure and impossible expectations, Caitlin felt as if someone were looking directly through her wounded soul. I know exactly what it's like to have the entire world microscopically watching every movement you make. I understand intimately what it's like to carry the hopes and dreams of millions of people. It was impossible not to feel that finally, for the first time in months of emotional isolation, someone really understood. Someone who had personally walked the same solitary path of exceptionality was saying, "I know exactly what you're going through psychologically." The sensation was absolutely overwhelming. It was like a child lost in a foreign crowd finally finding someone who speaks their native language amidst a world of incomprehensible strangers. But then came the moment that broke her emotionally, completely, and definitively. Steph Curry looked directly at the camera and said with absolute conviction, "Caitlin, if you're watching this, I want you to know one fundamental thing. You are not alone in this difficult journey." At that exact moment, Caitlin Clark collapsed into uncontrollable tears. They weren't tears of sadness, frustration, or despair. They were tears of deep emotional relief, of pure and inexpressible gratitude, of an emotional healing she didn't even know she needed so desperately. Have you ever wondered what the transformative sensation is of hearing exactly the words your soul was silently screaming to hear? For psychologically devastating months, Caitlin had carried the crushing weight of emotional loneliness, the terrible feeling that no one really understood the unique pressure she faced, the painful belief that perhaps she was being excessively dramatic or emotionally fragile. And now, the most respected voice in basketball was validating not just her exceptional talent, but her specific emotional experience, was saying that her psychological struggles were real, understandable, and shared by others who had achieved similar greatness. Caitlin tried to articulate some verbal response, tried to form words that expressed what she was feeling, but discovered she was literally speechless. It was as if all words in the human vocabulary were completely inadequate to express the magnitude of the emotional transformation happening inside her. She watched the video 5 more consecutive times, and with each repetition, a different layer of deep emotional healing happened inside her wounded heart. The first time, she felt supreme technical validation of her talent. The second time, she felt empathetic understanding of her psychological struggles. The third time, she felt renewed hope about her future. The fourth time, she felt inner strength she didn't know she possessed. The fifth time, she felt self-love gradually returning. What impresses most profoundly is how specific words can have the power to completely rebuild a person's self-esteem and confidence. Steph Curry hadn't just generically praised Caitlyn. He had used his supreme credibility and technical authority to specifically shield her against all the doubts she carried as psychological burdens. Naturally, this leads us to the transformation that began to happen inside her almost instantaneously. It was like watching a flower that had been withering under scorching sun suddenly receive the exact nutritious water it needed to return to life. The first change was immediately physical. Caitlyn automatically straightened up, as if an invisible but oppressive weight had been magically removed from her shoulders. The second change was in her gaze. There was a new light there, a confidence that had been dormant for months of psychological pressure. But the deepest and most lasting change was completely internal. For the first time in a very long time, Caitlyn looked in the mirror and saw what Steph Curry had seen: a truly exceptional player who deserved to be exactly where she was, regardless of external criticisms. "I am not alone," she whispered to herself repeatedly, as if it were a mantra of emotional healing. "I really am not alone in this journey." It was impossible to adequately describe the sensation of emotional relief that flooded her entire being like a wave of healing, as if she had been psychologically holding her breath for months and could finally breathe freely without fear. Caitlyn picked up her phone and began typing a public response, but stopped abruptly. The words seemed too small, completely inadequate for the magnitude of what Steph Curry had done for her emotionally. How do you adequately thank someone for literally saving your emotional soul from collapse? Instead of trying to force words that didn't exist in human vocabulary, Caitlyn decided to do something different and more meaningful. She decided that the best way to thank him would be to continue being exactly who Steph Curry had seen when he looked at her: a force of nature that was changing basketball forever. But now, she would do it with a crucial and transformative difference. She would do it knowing with absolute certainty that she wasn't alone, that there were people in the world who understood her unique journey, that her greatness was real and recognized by those who truly mattered in the basketball universe. The transformation was just beginning to manifest. Because when someone removes the devastating weight of emotional loneliness from the shoulders of an exceptional person, there is no conceivable limit to what she can achieve when liberated from her psychological chains. Steph Curry had done something infinitely more important than simply publicly praising Caitlyn Clark. He had freed her complete emotional potential by healing her from wounds she didn't even know could be healed. And the world was about to witness a version of Caitlyn Clark that not even she knew existed within her. A version emotionally healed, psychologically strengthened, and absolutely unstoppable in her determination. The young woman who had cried from emotional exhaustion was rapidly transforming into the woman who would change basketball forever. And it all began with words that left her literally speechless, but filled her heart with a renewed strength she never knew it was possible to possess as a human being. The days that followed Steph Curry's transformative words were nothing less than magical in their quality of emotional renewal. It was like watching a complete metamorphosis happening in real time, a transformation so profound and comprehensive that it seemed impossible it had been triggered merely by words, even though they were words laden with such authenticity and emotional power. But you can perceive that certain words carry a transformational power that completely transcends common language and reaches directly to the core of the human soul, especially when they come from someone whose credibility is unquestionable worldwide and whose heart demonstrates genuine generosity. The first dramatically visible change in Caitlin Clark happened in her next public appearance. It was just a routine post-practice interview, the type of media commitment she had faced hundreds of times before throughout her career. But this time, there was something completely different and notable about her physical and emotional presence. Her posture radiated a serene confidence that simply didn't exist before the moment of healing. Her eyes sparkled with an inner light that had been extinguished for months of psychological pressure. Most importantly, there was a deep inner peace that manifested clearly in every word she articulated and every gesture she made. When asked specifically about Steph Curry's public statements, Caitlin made a long and contemplative pause, as if she were carefully savoring the memory of that transformative moment that had changed her life. "Honestly," she said, her voice laden with deep and authentic emotion that was absolutely impossible to fake or fabricate, "I was completely speechless. Literally speechless. For entire months, I carried so many devastating doubts about myself, so much crushing, psychological pressure, so much paralyzing fear of not being enough. And then one of the people I most admire in the entire world said exactly what my soul desperately needed to hear." It was impossible not to feel the pure and transparent authenticity in her words. She wasn't just giving a rehearsed or diplomatically correct answer. She was sharing a genuine piece of her most intimate and vulnerable emotional journey. "But what touched me most profoundly," she continued with growing conviction, "weren't just the specific technical compliments. It was when he said I wasn't alone in this journey. It was when he recognized that the pressure I felt was real and completely valid. It was when someone who had personally gone through the same solitary path told me it was normal and understandable to feel the way I was feeling. How is it possible that empathetic recognition of our struggles is sometimes more healing and transformative than recognition of our talents?" The answer was becoming crystal clear through Caitlin's visible transformation. Steph Curry had validated not just her unquestionable greatness as a player, but her vulnerable humanity as a person facing extraordinary emotional challenges that few can comprehend. And this dual validation produced results that no one could have anticipated in their magnitude. In the weeks that followed, Caitlin's performance on the court reached levels that seemed impossible even for her already extraordinary and historical standards. But it wasn't just about statistical numbers or broken records. It was about a magnetic presence that had been exponentially amplified by emotional healing. She played with a freedom and spontaneity that simply didn't exist before. She shot with confidence that seemed completely unshakable. She led with natural authority that commanded instant respect from teammates, opponents, and observers. It was like watching someone who had finally completely embraced their own greatness, without reservations or psychological limitations. Naturally, this leads us to the profound impact this personal transformation had far beyond Caitlin Clark herself. Because when someone heals emotionally and embraces their complete potential, the waves of inspiration spread like concentric circles in a lake, reaching people in completely different places and situations. The story of the emotional connection between Steph Curry and Caitlin Clark began to spread far beyond the specific world of basketball. It wasn't just routine sports news. It was a universal human narrative about the transformative power of the right words, said at the right moment, with genuine intention. Parents across the country began using the story as a practical example for their children about the crucial importance of supporting and recognizing other human beings. Teachers incorporated the narrative into lessons about practical empathy and moral leadership. Coaches at all levels used Curry's example to teach their athletes about how true champions elevate other champions. A mother from Oregon wrote an emotional letter that went viral on social media. "My daughter was experiencing severe bullying at school and had completely lost confidence in herself. When I showed her Steph Curry's video defending Caitlin Clark, she cried tears of relief and said, 'If he can defend someone like that publicly, I can also defend myself.' Those words literally saved my daughter's self-esteem." A high school coach in TDD, Alabama shared, "I use the story to teach my players that true greatness isn't just about individual performance or personal achievements. It's about using your position of influence to elevate other human beings." Steph Curry became our definitive model of how a true leader acts when it matters. Have you ever wondered how a single act of authentic kindness can create waves of transformation that reach people we will never personally know? The answer was manifesting through hundreds of similar stories that emerged spontaneously. The moment between Curry and Caitlin had become a universal symbol of the transformational power of genuine support and empathetic recognition. But perhaps the most profound and lasting impact was on the culture of professional sports itself. Other established athletes began consciously following Curry's example, using their platforms to elevate and protect emerging talents who faced similar pressures. It was as if Steph Curry had established a new, permanent standard of moral leadership in sports, a standard that clearly said, when you achieve greatness and influence, your responsibility is to use that greatness to protect and elevate other human beings. What impresses most profoundly is how this moment permanently redefined Caitlin Clark's relationship with herself in a transformative way. Months later, in a deep and reflective interview, she articulated the transformation. "Before that transformative moment, I was constantly fighting against destructive inner voices that told me I didn't deserve to be where I was, that maybe I was just temporary luck that would soon disappear, that the criticisms had foundation, and I was really overrated," she said, her voice firm but touched by the memory of that psychological pain. But when Steph Curry looked directly at the camera and said I wasn't alone, when he validated not just my talent, but my specific emotional experience, something changed permanently inside me. I understood that greatness isn't about never having doubts or fears. It's about having people who believe in you when you temporarily can't believe in yourself. It was impossible not to perceive how these words carried emotional wisdom that transcended chronological age and experience. Caitlin had learned a lesson about humanity and mutual support that many take decades to fully understand. Naturally, this leads us to the understanding that the true permanent legacy of this moment isn't in broken records or conquered titles. It's in the tangible proof that the right words, said with genuine intention and perfect timing, can literally save and transform human lives. Steph Curry had conclusively demonstrated that when you possess supreme credibility and worldwide influence, you have the moral responsibility to use it for emotional healing, not just superficial impressing. That when you see someone psychologically drowning in pressure and isolation, you have the power to throw an emotional lifeline. Years later, when cultural historians write about this era of basketball and American culture, one specific moment will be remembered as the definitive and irreversible turning point. It wasn't a historical game with impressive statistics. It wasn't an exciting championship with sporting drama. It was the precise moment when the greatest revolutionary of the three-point shot looked at a young revolutionary being systematically, psychologically persecuted and said with all his moral authority, "Enough. You are not alone." And when Steph Curry says something with all his technical credibility and moral authority, the entire world stops, listens with total attention, and changes forever. The deafening silence that had dominated for months was replaced by something much more powerful and lasting, the harmonious symphony of millions of voices voluntarily uniting in defense of true greatness and emotional protection of exceptional talents. Steph Curry's powerful words not only temporarily left Caitlin Clark speechless, they filled her with a renewed inner strength she will carry forever. A strength she is already consciously passing forward to the next generation of young athletes who need to know they are not alone in their unique journeys. Because that is the true lasting magic of the right words said at the right moment. They not only transform who receives them, they create an eternal cycle of transformation that continues spreading long after the initial. Words are forgotten by headlines. Steph Curry planted a seed of emotional healing that will continue flowering for future generations, and Caitlin Clark became both the nutritious fruit of that seed and the dedicated gardener who ensures it continues growing and spreading. Some moments change individual lives, others change the entire world. This moment did both simultaneously, and it all began with an extraordinary man who consciously decided it was time to use his influential voice for something infinitely greater than basketball. To remind us that, in the end, we are all human beings needing genuine recognition, empathetic support, and the simple, comforting certainty that we are not alone in our most difficult struggles. The most powerful words are those that heal profoundly. And Steph Curry had just given us a permanent masterclass in how to use words to transform lives forever.